Welcome to today's episode, number 70. Today I'm welcoming Nikki Shaheed, Birthing from Within trainer, mentor, and birth doula.
Welcome to Birth Words. Words are powerful. What are you doing with yours? In this podcast, birth doula and applied linguistics scholar Sarah Pixton invites you to be intentional, reflective, and empowering with your language as we come together to honor those who give birth. The work of Birth Words is to elevate the language surrounding pregnancy, birth, and the postpartum period. Nothing in this podcast should be taken as medical advice.
Nikki Shaheed is a Birthing from Within trainer, mentor, and birth doula. She teaches informative and heart-opening childbirth classes in North Central San Antonio, as well as online. Since 2012, the focus of her work has been bringing compassion to birth and parenting. In her childbirth classes, she fosters realistic expectations about birth, normalizing excitement, doubt, love, fear, and everything in between during labor. She's guided hundreds of families through the transformation of birth as a childbirth educator and doula. With each new family she meets, she gains new insights and wisdom, learning from each parent as much as they learn from her. Nikki, welcome to the Birth Words podcast, and thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So we read your bio. They know that you are a Birthing from Within instructor. So we're going to kind of talk about birthing from within and that approach to childbirth during this interview.
Yeah.
So I'm going to just jump right into some questions that I have for you.
Yeah.
So I recently finished reading Birthing from Within, and in chapter 1, it starts out with Pam England, the author, talking about finding your question to guide your birth preparation. My question for you, Nikki, is when you're teaching your childbirth classes, how do you guide your students in your classes to find their own personal questions to guide their birth preparation?
Yeah. Parents come in and they have a lot of questions, right? And basically, they're trying to figure out, how am I going to get through this? And some of the questions that come up kind of invoke self-judgment, right? Will I be strong enough to do this? Or doubt in other people, or wanting to control other people, right? Will my partner show up the way that I need them to? And so the heart's question kind of readjusts the lens through which we're looking at birth preparation. So unlike many of the questions people ask about birth, where they're looking to the experts to give them the right answer, the heart's question is more introspective. So with the heart's question, we're helping people look within at what they are needing to foster more of within themselves in order to prepare for birth. So with a heart's question, it has to be about you. It can't be, how do I get my doctor or midwife to do what I want them to do? It has to be about you, and it has to be in the present moment, because a lot of questions are like, well, someday I'll work on that. Someday I'll get to that. But a heart's question actually can't be answered with words. It's not a heady question. It can only be answered with action. So an example of a heart's question could be, how am I showing myself compassion in this moment? Or what does this moment call for? Right? It's really looking at, what is that attribute that I'm needing to cultivate in order to get through the birth process and feel more intact on the other side.
I love that. And I love how you talked about it's not a question that can be answered in words, because my podcast, obviously, Birth Words, focuses a lot on language and its place and power in the birth space, but we also talk a lot about its limitations. Yeah. And I like that we can phrase a question with language that can be a meaningful guide for the birth journey. But the answers to that question transcend language's ability to capture.
They do. And another thing I love about it is that it helps you to be very present because how I'm showing myself compassion in this moment, that might be I'm going to work on a project that I'm very excited about. And in a different moment, showing myself compassion might be resting, right? So it's also helping people to practice living in the moment and responding to their present needs.
Cool. So generally, what would you say once your students find their heart's question, how does that question influence the way they go about the rest of their pregnancy and their birth experience? You've spoken a little bit to that already, but anything you would add?
Yeah. So when it comes to cultivating the kind of attributes that are so helpful in birth, like flexibility, self-compassion, resilience, we don't want to wait until we're in the birth space to start working on that or start to access it. And so when people can ask themselves that question throughout their day, during their pregnancy, then it's helping their mind to start to orient to the present moment and start to focus on what am I moving towards? So that by the time they get to their labor, this is a muscle that has been developed and strengthened. And now this is more accessible in labor than if it had just been an intellectual question.
I like that. Awesome. Cool. I feel like there's so much good content. We're going to move along, kind of shift gears a little bit later on in Birthing from Within in chapter 21, in case anyone's following along at home. It talks about the imagined tigers in the birth space and the images that birthers can have of giving birth, whether positive or negative. How do these tigers or more positive images influence the experiences that people have giving birth?
One of the ways I like to look at this is on an archetypal level, right? So what is the archetype that is being invoked? And if people have imagery of being helpless or being overpowered, then that's the archetypal energy that's being carried into it, right? And people may have imagery of feeling strong and feeling determined. And that can be carried into it as well. I think it's interesting to explore if somebody is wanting an image of strength and that's what they're trying to move towards. What happens in the moments where one doesn't feel strong during labor, right? Does this open up the door for self-judgment? So it's this interesting kind of scale or double-edged sword, if you will, where it can tip out of balance in either direction in a way that could leave the birth giver feeling disappointed or let down or frustrated with themselves. So when it comes to looking at tigers and looking at the imagery, what we really want to do is help people explore how they could take action if an unwished for event were to occur, right? So instead of being in avoidance of unwished for events, the tiger's process helps people to take a courageous and compassionate look at their fears or their worries and take it that step further to how could I take action? Because we know that taking action reduces the likelihood of trauma. And it doesn't have to be taking action that saves the day and changes everything, right? It's simply showing up and doing your best, doing the next best thing, helping yourself or helping your partner. That alone can reduce trauma, even if it doesn't change the medical outcome of the birth. So what I like to help people focus on when we're looking at tigers is seeing themselves in the love warrior archetype, where they are taking action. They are doing the next best thing, whether that is what they plan to do ahead of time or whether it is something different that the moment is calling for.
Thank you. How do you guide your students to foster that identity and that connection with that love warrior archetype? How do they take it upon themselves?
So generally speaking, we're talking about moving from more innocent archetypes where somebody might, somebody might feel like if I just hope and wish and I think positive thoughts, it's going to go the way I want it to. Or they might also think thoughts like, I'm not even going to hope. I'm not even going to try because I don't trust that it's going to turn out the way I want. There may even be thoughts like, well, I need to caretake everybody else in the birth space instead of taking care of myself. So what we're trying to do with shifting them into the love warrior is to help them start to first awaken their hunter or huntress archetype.
Okay.
And this archetype is very curious and also inward looking. So the huntress or the hunter asks, what do I already know about getting through hard things? What do I already know about how to help my partner get through hard things? What do I know about coping? What do I already know or believe about birth, right?
Mm-hmm.
And also helping people explore the different beliefs that they bring into the birth space with them. So if they have a belief that they shouldn't rock the boat, it's going to be hard for them to engage in a conversation with their provider where maybe they are feeling conflicted about something that the provider is proposing, right? So if we can help people to start to look within at their inner resources and also become very curious about their beliefs and how they could affect the birth process, then the next step is to take action, right? So the love warrior takes action, and they are also full of compassion for themselves and everybody else in that space, whatever space someone is in. So it is through that curiosity, it is through that examination of ideas, beliefs, wisdom, experiences, and inner resources that we can then awaken the love warrior and start stepping into actions that feel more true to themselves.
Yeah. And I imagine for most birth givers that is a lengthy process that takes a good chunk of the pregnancy experience to move through that curiosity into that more agentive action-taking space. Is that true?
Yeah, so the earlier people can begin to do this work, then the more time and space they have for that process. And at the same time, in classes, I am working with parents who are in their third trimester typically.
Mm-hmm.
And so my job as a mentor is to help people do some excavation and to plant some seeds and be okay with them sprouting later on, but just planting those seeds of curiosity and self-compassion for parents.
Cool. I love that two-way kind of being curious, looking backwards, and even at the present moment, what am I doing? And then shifting into, okay, now what am I doing moving forward? Something that I've talked about on this podcast frequently is the importance of being reflective and intentional, and then moving forward to be empowering. And it's kind of a process to move through each of those steps.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. So shifting gears a little bit more, Birthing from Within talks about Laborland, this sort of psychological state that birth givers inhabit, especially during an unmedicated birth.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to us a little bit about Laborland and the appropriate etiquette for others that are in that space with the birth giver.
Yeah. To help parents understand Laborland, I will often ask them who here has ever seen a dog or a cat give birth. And then I'll ask parents, well, where does a dog or a cat give birth, right? And they'll tell me under the bed or under the porch or in a dark closet. And that opens up the conversation for parents to explore what is it that I would need to feel a sense of warmth and safety and protection. So I also want to acknowledge that it's important not to be too prescriptive about what people will need in Laborland, because everybody's coming from a different place. So many people like rhythmic movement and mantras and for it to be dark, and maybe there's dim lighting and soft music playing. But really it comes down to what is going to help me feel safe and protected. And so for some folks, that means having their whole family there, and it's almost like a party, right? Mm-hmm. So we definitely want to be mindful of not making assumptions about what everybody needs in Laborland. But I find that helping people relate to the dog or the cat makes those connections better in their brain to, oh, okay, maybe this is something that I can think about as far as my birth space. When it comes to the etiquette of Laborland, it's, I think, really about understanding the birthing individual and understanding their needs. So most people get to do that ahead of time, right? If that's the doula or a family member or a midwife they've been working with throughout their pregnancy, they get to know that person and get a feel for what their vibe is and what their needs are. But also sometimes we have to show up spontaneously. I mean, it could be a nurse who's walking into a delivery room and meeting somebody for the first time, or another circumstance where that relationship building didn't get to happen ahead of time. And once again, it comes back to being present, right? Being present and observing what's going on, taking in the situation and not assuming that this birth giver needs the same thing as the last birth giver who I accompanied through their birth, right? So really being in the moment. And my favorite way to do that when I enter a birth space is to match my breath with the laboring parents, right? I feel like it helps me get on the same wavelength as them. It helps me slow down, get out of my head, and really connect with them in a way that guides my next step so that I'm not doing exactly what I did at the last birth, unless that's what the moment calls for. But I'm really asking my own heart's question about what this moment calls for.
I like that a lot. I'm going to have to give that specific approach a try next time I'm in the birth space.
Yeah.
Is there any specific guidance regarding the language, the way, how, and what birth partners or anybody in that space says that you would say is important to add to your descriptions of Laborland etiquette?
Well, there are some things that I like to help partners understand are probably not going to be helpful in labor. Even the ones that seem like a good idea, like saying breathe to someone who's in labor. They are breathing, first of all, and it can feel kind of judgmental, right? Like, oh, am I out of control or am I breathing wrong?
Yeah.
So even to take the E off and say breath, or I will tell them if breathe slips out, just say breathe with me, right? So avoiding breathe, avoiding relax. We can understand the value of the breath or relaxation in labor, but it has kind of the same impact when we tell somebody to relax. Another one that seems like a good idea is you can do it, right? And there's nothing wrong with saying that, but it's sort of future oriented. So I encourage partners to say you are doing it.
Yeah.
And I also encourage families to sit down together, families or whoever the birth team will be, sit down together and make a list of things that the pregnant parent feels might be helpful to hear in labor, because I have my ideas, but they often have more specific ideas that really speak to their needs and their desires.
Yeah. I really appreciate that. And specifically drawing importance to directives or those very specific suggestions, sometimes doing more harm than good. And I like how you just even switched breathe, the verb and the command, to breath, to like, let's draw our awareness to the importance of this principle.
Exactly.
But it does it in a lot softer way.
Yes.
Like that. Thank you. Okay, so we're wrapping up already with the final question, which is, if you had to describe the process of pregnancy and birth in just one word, what word would you choose?
The word I would choose would be unknown. I think in our birth culture right now, there is a tendency, there is a desire to try to help parents educate their way out of the unknown. And it is really important to be informed about birth and to be savvy about the medical environment. But I feel like there is so much information being pushed on parents or that parents are taking in that it doesn't leave a lot of space for the unknown. And the unknown is the one element that shows up at just about every birth.
Yeah.
So if we can begin to normalize the unknown and help people understand it is okay to go into the birth process and not have all the answers ahead of time. It is okay to not know exactly how you're going to cope or what you're going to need, but to help them get a sense of, to help them build a pain coping mindset, right? And just a coping mindset in general can help parents feel a little more space to be able to move through whatever birth brings their way, and a certain amount of confidence that they can meet that thing. Even if they don't know what it's going to be ahead of time, they can meet that thing and they can do the next best thing, take the next small step, and do what the moment calls for.
I love that. And I feel like we've come full circle back to talking about your heart's questions at the beginning, that you said just now, it's okay to go into the birth space not having all the answers, but to be guided by the right questions, right? I think there's some power and beauty in letting our questions guide us.
Absolutely. If we can embrace the unknown, then we can bring more of a sense of curiosity into the birth space. And that could be curiosity about the intensity. It could be curiosity about how many F-bombs am I going to need to drop to get through this, right? It can just be a sense of, I wonder what will happen, instead of I need to try to control what will happen.
I really appreciate that. I feel like I'm going to want to listen to this episode on repeat to just ponder over all the many little bits of wisdom that you've shared throughout. So I thank you so much for coming into this space and sharing it with me and with my listeners.
Thanks so much for having me.
If you're interested in sharing your ideas or experiences on the podcast, go to birthwords.com. If you're liking what you hear, please leave a review on your podcast app. For more resources about language for a better birth, subscribe to the monthly newsletter at birthwords.com and follow Birthwords on Instagram and Facebook.